Construction worker feeds disabled child without knowing he is the son of a millionaire woman. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? And if you love intense love stories with twists and heartwarming endings, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you help this space grow and continue bringing stories that touch the soul. The late afternoon sun beat down on the hot asphalt in downtown Dallas. The constant noise of machinery and the smell of dry concrete still hung in the air when Jake Mitchell, wearing faded jeans, dust-covered boots, and a sweaty gray shirt stuck to his body, sat down on a park bench, exhausted. His sunburned face showed lines carved by time and hard work, but there was something kind in his grayish-green eyes. He took a sandwich wrapped in foil from his lunchbox and opened it calmly, like someone in no hurry to get home. Because, truth be told, no one was waiting for him. In front of him, a small park with a partial view of the avenue. Kids played in the distance, but it was a boy sitting in the shade that caught his eye. Sitting in a motorized wheelchair, the boy watched intently. He looked about 7 years old, with very light blue eyes and straight blonde hair falling over his forehead. His delicate body contrasted with his curious and lively expression. Jake looked at the sandwich, then at the boy. He stood up slowly and walked over. "Hungry, champ?" he asked with a quiet smile. The boy didn't respond with words, but his eyes lit up. He simply pointed to his stomach and smiled shyly. Jake crouched next to the wheelchair, split the sandwich in half, and offered the wrapped piece to the boy. "It's ham and cheese, nothing fancy, but it fills you up." The boy carefully took the sandwich, using one hand that trembled slightly. His thin, fragile fingers showed how hard it was for him to move. Even so, he looked incredibly grateful. Jake sat on the curb next to him. The two of them ate in silence, watching the busy city rush by. It was like that moment had been plucked from another time. Across the street, a black car with tinted windows sat parked. In the back seat, Victoria Langford watched everything in silence. She wore a flawless white blazer and had her blonde hair tied in a sophisticated bun. Her pale, elegant face looked tired, but her blue eyes were fixed on her son. The security guard behind the wheel didn't dare say a word. "He smiled," she murmured, emotional. "Ethan hasn't smiled like that in weeks." Victoria didn't know who that man was, but something inside her wavered, a part she thought was dead stirred. Trust in simple gestures. Fear followed right after, like a reflex. "Let's go," she said firmly. "I want to take Ethan home." As the car approached, Jake stood up and looked toward the vehicle as it stopped. The driver got out and went to the boy. The back door opened, and Victoria stepped out. High heels, steady steps, controlled posture. But when she looked Jake in the eyes, her composure cracked for a moment. "Thank you for feeding my son," she said, choosing every word like she was walking on glass. "He has difficulties and doesn't usually interact with strangers." Jake nodded, not showing any surprise. He just looked hungry. "No need to thank me for that." Victoria studied this sweaty man with calloused hands and honest eyes. He had no idea who she was. That unsettled her. "Have a good night," she said at last, trying to stay composed. Jake just nodded and sat back on the bench like nothing had happened. But something had happened, something important. Ethan looked back through the window as the car pulled away, still holding the sandwich wrapper. On the sidewalk, Jake stayed there a few more minutes. He looked up at the sky that was beginning to darken and murmured to himself, "Just a kid, just a sandwich." But deep down, he knew that brief encounter had stirred something inside him that had been asleep for a long time. The sky was already starting to turn orange when the black car turned the corner and disappeared into the evening traffic. Jake stayed on the bench, quiet, staring at the spot where the boy had been just seconds before. There was something about that kid, something he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, the kind of look that carried more than a child should have to carry. Or maybe it was the silence, a silence that spoke to him in a way no one had in a long time. He took a deep breath, opened his water bottle, and took a sip, looking at the buildings around him, far too tall for someone who had spent his whole life on the ground. His thoughts drifted back to the boy's fragile face, and without realizing it, a faint smile escaped. Inside the slowly moving car a few blocks away, Victoria Langford kept her eyes fixed on the reflection in the rearview mirror. She was silent, but inside, a battle was taking place. The driver took a chance and said, "Should I take you straight home, Mrs. Langford?" She took a few seconds to respond. "Yes, but drive slowly." Victoria was used to being in control of everything, her company, her schedule, her appearance, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw on that park bench. That man, covered in cement, with rough hands and a quiet demeanor, had done more for her son in 10 minutes than specialists and therapists had done in months. She looked over at Ethan, sitting beside her, still holding the crumpled foil wrapper with a small piece of bread on his lap. He was smiling silently, the kind of smile she rarely saw anymore since the accident. "He made you laugh, son," she whispered softly, like a confession. "You laughed." Outside, the city carried on. Honking horns, traffic lights, hurried footsteps on the sidewalks. But inside that car, time seemed suspended. Victoria felt a lump in her throat. Her son, the boy for whom she had given up her international career, fought legal battles, lived secluded and alone, had connected with a stranger, not a trained tutor, not a renowned therapist, but a construction worker. And that's when fear blended with gratitude, a fear she knew all too well, the fear of losing control, the fear of allowing herself to trust, the fear of cracking open the wall she had built around herself ever since everything fell apart. "He seemed trustworthy," she said suddenly, as if speaking to herself. The driver frowned in the rearview mirror, surprised. "Who, ma'am?" Victoria didn't answer. She was far away, on the park bench, in her son's smile, in the eyes of that man who, for a moment, made her remember what it was like to feel something pure. Meanwhile, Jake slowly stood up. He put what was left of the bottle back into his old lunchbox and stretched, feeling the pain in his shoulders that years of labor had left behind. He was still thinking about the boy. There was something different about him, and it wasn't just the wheelchair. It was as if that little stranger had touched a part of Jake that had been asleep for a long time, something he thought had died with his wife years ago. "See you later, champ," he murmured into the empty air. Then he walked off through the narrow streets, unaware that fate was already beginning, right then and there, to weave the threads of a story that would change everything. But that night, when he lay down in his narrow bed in the rented trailer, on the other side of town, Jake dreamed of the boy's smile, and for the first time in a long while, he slept with a lighter heart. And Victoria, in her silent mansion surrounded by security and luxury, couldn't sleep at all. The image of that man sharing bread with her son wouldn't leave her mind, nor the sound of that laughter. She just didn't know that this was the beginning, the start of a transformation that would shift everything, including what she thought had already been buried. The next morning, the typical Texas heat was already creeping in before 8 o'clock. The sky was clear, and the city moved on amid honking and hurried footsteps. In the quieter part of the park where everything had happened the day before, Jake returned to the same bench. It was his ritual on days when the construction site delayed material deliveries, a rare moment of rest in the middle of the chaos. This time, he hadn't brought a sandwich, just a cup of cheap, bitter coffee he'd bought from a nearby food truck. His thoughts were far off, but not far enough to miss the soft sound of wheels on the pavement. When he turned his head, there he was, Ethan in his motorized chair, approaching with eyes lit up with joy. Victoria walked just behind him. She wore a light blue linen dress, simple, discreet, contrasting with her elegant heels. Her blonde hair was down, moving in the breeze. Unlike the day before, she looked hesitant. Ethan stopped in front of Jake and raised one hand in an awkward wave. The gesture was simple but full of meaning. Jake smiled sincerely and crouched to the boy's level. "Hey, champ, good to see you again," he said, his voice low and warm. For a moment, Victoria just stood and watched the scene. The way Jake spoke to her son, without pity, without exaggeration, was different from anything she was used to. He treated him like a normal child, like an equal. "He wanted to come here," she said at last, crossing her arms like someone trying to shield themselves from their own vulnerability. "Since last night, he hasn't stopped talking about you. Well, trying to anyway. He wrote your name in a notebook over and over." Jake stood up, a bit self-conscious. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a habit that gave away his shyness. "I just shared a sandwich. It wasn't a big deal." Victoria looked him in the eyes for the first time. She expected to see curiosity, maybe that uncomfortable admiration she was used to. But no, what she saw was respect, a rare, calm respect, and it threw her off. "Still," she said softly, "thank you." Jake nodded but didn't look away, not out of arrogance, but out of honesty. And in that silent moment when the sounds of the city seemed to fade, something passed between them, faint but real. Ethan, with some effort, moved his chair a few inches forward and grabbed Jake's arm. His tiny fingers squeezed with surprising strength. It was the kind of gesture you don't rehearse. It was pure affection. Victoria felt a pang in her chest. But for the first time in years, it wasn't pain. It was something more delicate. A forgotten memory of what it felt like to have hope. Hope that there were still good people in the world, that her son, despite everything, could still form real bonds. "Do you work around here?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Jake pointed to the construction site down the block. "Yeah, new community clinic. We're renovating everything over there, but today there was a delay with the cement blocks. So I decided to wait here." She nodded, but stayed quiet for a moment. Just watched how comfortable Ethan looked next to him. More than comfortable, connected. "Maybe," Victoria started, then stopped herself. Jake raised an eyebrow, curious. "Maybe what?" She took a deep breath. She wasn't the kind of woman who improvised, but in that moment it was like a part of her wanted to test the unknown. "Maybe you could come to our house one of these days. Ethan, he doesn't get attached to anyone like this, not even the specialists we've hired, and it would just be a visit, no obligations." Jake looked surprised. He glanced at the boy, then back at her. "Only if it's not a bother." Victoria gave a small smile, the first real one in a long time. "If it were a bother, I wouldn't be inviting you." Jake smiled back modestly, and then he said simply, "Then it's settled." Ethan let out a small, joyful sigh, like he had just won an invisible battle, and Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. But this time, she didn't want to run from it. In that moment, under the soft morning light, no more words were said, but their eyes said plenty. And as Victoria and Ethan walked away, Jake stood still for a few seconds, watching them. Something in him had changed too. And behind Victoria's composed face, hidden under layers of pride, trauma, and silence, her heart had begun to soften. 2 days later, on a clear Saturday morning, a black car with tinted windows pulled up discreetly in front of one of the most imposing homes in Highland Park, Dallas. Behind the automatic gates, surrounded by pristine gardens and tall ivy-covered walls, stood the Langford Mansion, a world of cold marble, controlled silence, and secrets stacked like artwork on the walls. Jake Mitchell stepped out of his old pickup truck that didn't quite fit in with the neighborhood. He had his tool backpack slung over one shoulder and a makeshift clipboard of notes in his hand. He wore the same shirt as always, now clean, but still showing traces of old paint near the collar. His gaze was focused but unassuming. It wasn't his first time working in luxury homes, but something about this one felt different, like it wasn't just another job. Victoria was waiting in the house's foyer, dressed in tailored beige pants and a light white blouse. Her posture was flawless as always, but her face showed a trace of masked tension. When the door was opened by the butler, she stepped forward before any formalities could kick in. "Jake, I'm glad you came," she said, trying to sound natural. He took off his worn cap and smiled kindly. "Of course. You said you needed help with a few repairs, right?" "Yes. There are leaks on the side veranda and the studio door lock is sticking. Simple things, but I prefer someone I can trust." She went silent for a second. Trust. The word echoed uncomfortably inside her. Jake nodded with a slight tilt of his head. "Can you show me?" As she guided him through the spacious hallways, Jake felt the weight of the silence. The house was beautiful, yes, but cold. The walls seemed to hold not just expensive paintings, but untold stories. Ethan was nowhere in sight. When they got to the veranda, Jake began examining the damp wall. Victoria watched from a distance, leaning against the doorframe, seeming both hostess and stranger in her own home. "Is it always this quiet around here?" he asked without turning. She took a while to respond. After what happened with Ethan, silence became the norm. Jake stopped, stood up, and looked at her carefully. "And what happened to you? Did that become the norm too?" Victoria was taken aback by the question. No one ever dared ask anything. Everyone was too afraid to cross lines. But not him. She looked down for a moment, then met his gaze again. It did. It became a world where everything has to be in place, except the heart. Jake simply nodded. He didn't need to say anything, just listen. Hours later, as he worked on fixing the studio lock, Ethan appeared in his wheelchair, brought by the nurse. As soon as he saw Jake, the boy's eyes lit up. He moved with effort and stretched out his arms, asking to be held. Victoria swallowed hard. Jake crouched down casually. "Want to help Uncle Jake fix this?" Ethan giggled softly, almost soundlessly, but his eyes sparkled with excitement. Jake positioned him next to the toolbox and let him hold a wrench, even if he didn't have the strength to use it. Victoria leaned against the wall, watching the scene. Outwardly, she kept her composure, but inside, something was starting to crack. With each of Jake's visits for small repairs, what he was really fixing was something invisible, the gap between her and her son. The ice between her and the world. One afternoon, after he had finished adjusting the doors on Ethan's wardrobe, Victoria offered him a glass of lemonade in the kitchen. It was the first time they did something beyond the necessary. They sat at the granite table face to face. "Have you always been like this?" she asked suddenly. "Like what?" "This kind of man. The kind who treats everyone calmly, who looks people in the eye." Jake smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "No. I learned after I lost everything." She looked at him more closely. This wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. "What did you lose?" Jake took his time, but he answered, "My wife, in a car accident. It's been 5 years. Since then, I've just tried to do what I can, so I don't lose anything else." Victoria said nothing. But in that moment, she felt something inside her break and come back together, like a wine glass that falls but doesn't shatter. It just changes shape. At the end of the day, when she saw Jake say goodbye to Ethan with a pat on the head and a "see you next time, champ," Victoria had to turn her face away to hide what she felt, because in that gesture, there was a kind of affection she couldn't offer herself. And when the door closed behind him, she leaned her back against it. and stayed there for long minutes, feeling her heart beat in a way it hadn't in a long time. The rain came without warning that humid afternoon. Thick drops drummed against the mansion's windows, and the Dallas sky became a vast gray curtain. Inside, the sound of raindrops echoed through the quiet hallways. The only movement came from the second floor, where Jake Mitchell, sleeves rolled up and pant legs damp, climbed a portable ladder to reach a water stain on the library ceiling. He worked with focus, determined to seal the leak before the ceiling gave way any further. Natural light barely made it through the tall windows, and the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, almost melancholic. As he came down the ladder, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, Jake saw her. Victoria stood near the glass window in the side corridor. She was barefoot, wearing a light dress that clung to her body in the humid air. She held a glass of red wine in her hands, her gaze fixed on some vague point in the garden. He hesitated. He didn't want to intrude on the moment, but something about that scene, the visible solitude, the loaded silence, made him approach quietly. "I managed to stop the leak, but the roof's gonna need reinforcement. The structure's old," he said in a low voice, almost like an invitation to talk, not just a technical report. Victoria took a second to respond. Without turning, she replied softly, "Thank you. This house always lets me know when something inside it is falling apart." Jake leaned against the wall next to the window. She still didn't look at him, but it felt like she was speaking to someone, and for the first time, there was no hardness in her voice, only exhaustion. "It rained like this the day Ethan's father left," she said, after a sip of wine. "He said he couldn't handle being a supporting character in our own family anymore, and I stayed." Jake crossed his arms and looked out at the garden too, where the plants danced in the rain. "Staying takes more courage than leaving," he said calmly. "The one who walks away isn't always the strongest." Victoria took a deep breath. The glass turned slowly between her fingers. "Sometimes I wonder if I trusted too much, or trusted the wrong person. After that, I stopped trusting anyone." Jake lowered his eyes for a moment, as if searching for something inside himself. Then he looked up and met her gaze. "I lost my wife in an accident. We'd argued that morning. Something silly, routine stuff. I left for work without really saying goodbye. Hours later, I got the call." His voice faltered for a second, but he continued with dignity. "I spent months wondering if it was my fault. If I had said, 'I love you,' before I left. Maybe it would have made some difference. But life, it doesn't wait. And sometimes pain comes to teach us how to love for real." Victoria finally turned toward him. Her eyes were damp but still contained. She gave a faint smile, the kind that isn't joy, but resilience. "You talk like you still believe in love." Jake gave a slight half smile. "I don't believe in fairy tales, but I believe in what's real, in the small things." For a few seconds, silence stretched between them like a bridge. Outside, the rain fell hard. Inside, something delicate began to shift. Victoria lowered her head, as if not wanting to be seen in her vulnerability, and murmured, "I don't even remember what it feels like to truly trust someone." Jake took a step forward. He didn't touch her, didn't try to close the distance. He simply said, "Then maybe it's time to relearn." She looked up at him. This time, there was no mask, no armor. Just a woman tired of carrying it all. Alone, standing in front of a man who knew all too well what it meant to lose. And there, between the damp wood, the cooling wine, and the steady sound of the rain, the first crack appeared in her armor. It didn't hurt. Surprisingly, it didn't hurt. And she knew, even without knowing how, that this man, simple, sincere, and wounded, was about to change the course of her story. The house still carried the soft scent of wet wood from the afternoon rain. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a fresh breeze drifting through the open windows of the main living room. Inside the studio at the back of the property, Jake and Ethan sat side by side on a makeshift tarp, surrounded by pieces of wood, screws, white glue, and small tools. Ethan, with sharp eyes, watched Jake's every move in silent admiration. The boy held a piece of sandpaper with difficulty, while Jake patiently pointed, "Like this, always in the same direction, so you don't scratch up the whole piece of wood." Ethan tried to copy him, and even though his movements were clumsy, Jake smiled, encouraging him. "You're doing great, champ. This spaceship's gonna be the fastest in the universe." Victoria watched everything from a distance, through the crack of the hallway door left ajar. She wore a thin wool sweater over her cotton pajamas and held a cup of tea forgotten in her hands. What she saw wasn't just a beautiful moment. It was something rare, genuine, something she hadn't been able to offer her son in months. Jake didn't treat Ethan like he was fragile or like he was special. He treated him like an ordinary kid, and the boy responded with quiet joy, but it was full of truth. Later in the early evening, the house was silent. Ethan's nurse had left earlier, and the boy had fallen asleep on the couch with the unfinished wooden toy by his side. Victoria was in the kitchen, tidying up a few cups, when she heard footsteps coming down the hall. Jake walked in with a calm expression, his hair messy and a faint blue paint stain on the side of his white shirt. He was carrying 2 mugs. "Hot chocolate? Felt like the night called for it," he said, setting the mugs on the marble counter. Victoria raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You know how to make hot chocolate?" Jake chuckled softly. "I only know how to make a few things, but this one, I promise it's good." She picked up one of the mugs and took a small sip. The sweet, cozy taste contrasted with the cold air coming from the half-open window. "You've got a curious talent for making everything feel lighter," she said, smiling with a spark in her eyes that didn't come from her mouth. It came from within. Jake leaned against the counter, facing her, still holding his mug. They stood there, in a space where words had run out, and silence began to say more. "Some days I come here and forget the world outside is still spinning," he said, looking straight at her. "Forget that I'm just a guy with cement on." His hands. Victoria lowered her gaze, touched. "You're not just that, Jake. You never were." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, warm, filled with something that was about to happen. She looked back at him, and for the first time, there were no defenses in her eyes. Jake took a step closer. He was so near, she could smell wood, coffee, and dried rain. Their breaths overlapped. Their eyes stayed locked. He didn't force anything. He simply waited, that half-second of courage, of letting go, of permission, and Victoria hesitated. Her heart raced, her mind caught between desire and fear. She tilted her face almost imperceptibly. She was just about to give in, but then, like an invisible alarm going off inside her, she stepped back. "Sorry, she said, lowering her eyes. Jake nodded slowly, without resentment. "It's okay. It's okay." She wanted to say more, to explain what not even she understood, but she couldn't. She turned, walking slowly toward the kitchen door. Before leaving, she said, almost in a whisper, "Good night, Jake." He stayed there, still, with the warm mug in his hands, watching the empty space where she had stood seconds before. And then, alone in a kitchen that wasn't his, but where he left a piece of his heart every day, Jake murmured, "Good night, Victoria." And for the first time, it didn't hurt, but it also didn't bring relief. The days that followed passed as if time had lost its rhythm. The air between Jake and Victoria shifted between silent closeness and extreme caution not to cross invisible lines. Neither of them mentioned the almost kiss in the kitchen, but both carried the memory like a secret held close to the chest. tender but painful. Ethan seemed to be blooming. He laughed more, ate better, started showing interest in little challenges. Again, his bond with Jake had become so clear that even the household staff began to refer to Jake as Ethan's friend, with a spontaneous respect that no amount of money could buy. But in another part of the city, someone was watching with cold eyes and calculated precision. Benjamin Langford, Victoria's ex-husband, sat in front of a black marble desk in his office on the top floor of a financial tower in downtown Dallas. His icy gaze was locked on the laptop screen. The images his assistant had just handed over were exactly what he needed. Photos taken with a long lens, digitally edited to look intimate. In one, Jake held Ethan in his arms. In another, he and Victoria were standing too close, caught at an angle that suggested a kiss. The headline was, "Ready, sensationalist and cruel. Construction worker seduces vulnerable millionaire and exploits disabled child to climb the social ladder." Benjamin smiled without joy. "Let's see how long this strong woman act holds up under scandal," he muttered, before hitting send to the right reporter. The next morning, Victoria woke to her phone vibrating non-stop. Calls, messages, notifications. When she unlocked the screen, it was like a punch to the stomach. Gossip sites, business blogs, and even reputable profiles were all talking about the same scandal. Photos spread everywhere, harsh headlines, venomous comments. Langford Tech shareholders were demanding an urgent statement. Jake's name dragged through the mud, and hers, once again at the center of a storm. She rushed down the stairs, still in her sleepwear, hair down, eyes wide. She found Jake in the living room, playing on the floor with Ethan, as if the world was still whole. "Jake," she said, her voice unsteady. He turned, and when he saw her face, he knew something was wrong. "What happened?" She hesitated, but reality came crashing down on her like a concrete slab. "You need to go, now." Jake slowly stood up, confused. "Victoria, what are you talking about?" She walked over and handed him the phone, already opened to the main headline. Jake read in silence. The calm in his eyes slowly faded. "You think this is true?" he asked, without raising his voice, but with it cracking. Victoria avoided his gaze, crossed her arms like she always did when she wanted to seem strong, but was crumbling inside. "It's not about what I think. It's about what's happening out there. I have a company, shareholders, responsibilities. This is going to destroy everything I've fought for." Jake took a deep breath, once, twice. Then he looked at Ethan, who watched them in silence, not understanding, but sensing the rupture. "I never asked for anything, Victoria. I never got close to you or your son out of interest. You know that." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if those words hurt more than she could admit. "I can't take risks right now. I can't lose everything again." Jake stepped back, and when he spoke again, there was something in him Victoria had never seen. Disappointment. But it was a disappointment that came from a pure place, like she had broken something precious. "You already lost, Victoria. You just haven't realized it yet." He turned, picked up his things from the couch and walked to the door. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't beg for anything. Victoria remained still. The house was silent, but inside her, everything was screaming. Hours later, alone in the office, she watched the video footage again. She knew it had been manipulated. She knew Benjamin was behind it. But even so, she had chosen fear. And for the first time, she didn't feel protected by her walls. She felt empty. The house went back to being the way it was before Jake. Quiet, precise, unbreakable on the outside, but completely cracked on the inside. The hallways once again echoed with Victoria's footsteps, cold and firm, but now followed by a hollowness she couldn't ignore. In the first few days after he left, she tried to convince herself she'd done the right thing. She went back to work, kept her schedule, answered emails, maintained her image in front of investors. But every time she entered the house, the silence grew louder. And there was one detail she couldn't ignore. Ethan had stopped smiling. He wasn't eating well. He no longer spoke with enthusiasm to his caregivers. He avoided the room where he used to play with Jake and started having anxiety attacks at night. He called out for him, and even without words, Victoria understood every gesture, every sigh. "You miss him, don't you?" she asked one night, kneeling in front of his wheelchair, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know. I miss him, too." Ethan didn't reply. He just rested his face on her chest and closed his eyes. Victoria held him tightly, but inside it was like a mirror shattering slowly, piece by piece. Later that same night, after putting her son to bed, Victoria went into his room in silence. She opened the toy chest and found a blue notebook, slightly crumpled around the edges. It was where Ethan secretly drew. She flipped through it slowly, like someone entering a secret world. The first page showed a wheelchair with wings. On the second, 3 figures: a tall man in a cap, a woman in a dress, and a child in the middle. The 3 were holding hands. There was a house behind them, and a sun. But the detail that stood out most was the smiles on their faces. The kind of smile Ethan rarely drew. Victoria covered her mouth with one hand. The tears came uncontrollably. They fell onto the pages like a confession. She sat on the floor, the notebook in her lap, and cried. She cried like she hadn't in years, without restraint, without elegance. She cried for choosing fear, for letting public opinion dictate what her heart already knew. "Forgive me, my son," she whispered through sobs. "Forgive me for not being brave for the both of us." The following dawn, already in her robe, hair loose, she walked into the office. She opened her laptop and closed every sensationalist headline that was still saved. She deleted emails filled with cold advice from lawyers and image consultants. She picked up her phone, opened her contacts. His name was still there, Jake Mitchell. She stared at the screen for a few seconds. She hesitated, didn't know what to say, but she knew what she had to do. Victoria Langford, the woman who had built an empire by controlling variables, finally understood that love is not an equation, and that maybe the only way to rebuild everything was by allowing herself to break. And so, with her heart still in ruins, she decided another chance had to be given, even if it was only to herself. The day began with a foggy sky, as if the entire city were caught in a breath it refused to release. In the Oak Cliff neighborhood, far from the gleaming buildings and silent boardrooms, the ground was cracked concrete, and the colors came from peeling walls lovingly painted by volunteers. There, among the smell of strong coffee and stale bread, lives crossed paths, out of necessity but also by choice. Jake Mitchell stood carrying boxes of groceries to a makeshift table covered with old sheets used as a tablecloth. Children lined up, tired women held bags, elderly people waited their turn with quiet resignation. With each smile, he offered more than food. He offered presence. He wore a worn black cotton t-shirt and faded jeans, but his eyes held rare dignity. His body was that of a tireless worker, but his soul belonged to someone who still believed, even after all the falls. He was placing a can of powdered milk into an elderly woman's basket when he heard a sound that didn't belong there. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the entrance. Not ordinary shoes, heels, and the person wearing them walked like they weren't sure they belonged. Jake turned. Victoria Langford stood in the doorway. She was no longer the unshakable businesswoman, not the overburdened mother. She was simply herself, a woman in pieces trying to find her way back. She wore a light coat over a navy blue wool dress, her hair loosely tied, light makeup, but her eyes said everything. There was pain, there was regret, and something even rarer, vulnerability. She clutched her purse too tightly, like someone trying to hold on to the last thing they could control. Jake froze for a moment. The box in his hands slipped slightly, but he steadied it. He was surprised, but not angry. Just surprised to see her there, to truly see her. She took 2 hesitant steps forward, like the shelter was foreign ground, looked around awkwardly, unsure of where to start. Jake saved her from the attempt. "You don't have to say anything," he said with calm, almost tender firmness. "What I did for your son, I did out of love." Victoria felt her knees falter slightly. That dismantled her more than any words could. She bit her lip, fighting back tears. Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "And for me, what would you do?" The question came out in a whisper. It wasn't a challenge, it was a surrender. A request for repair, for a second chance, for truth. Jake stayed silent for a few seconds, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't answer, not with words. He took a step forward, then another. Now they were less than an arm's length apart. The noise of the shelter around them faded. The voices disappeared. Time slowed. Jake slowly raised his hand and with his fingertips touched the side of her face, with the delicacy of someone touching something sacred. His eyes were still on hers, as if silently asking, "Are you ready to truly feel?" And then he kissed her. It wasn't a rushed kiss. It wasn't impulsive like in the movies. It was a calm kiss, mature, full of tenderness. A kiss from someone who had waited for the right time, who chose silence over pressure and now simply offered. Their lips met gently, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The mistakes, the fears, the distance, all of it dissolved. And what was left was something new, something true. When they pulled apart, Victoria couldn't hold back any longer. The tears flowed freely, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. "I'm sorry for taking so long," she said, her voice trembling. Jake gave a soft smile, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye with his thumb. "Some things only come when we finally learn to open the door." Victoria took a deep breath, as if finally allowing herself to be whole. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the CEO or the strong mother or the wounded woman. She was just a person, and beside him, she felt complete. Across the room, a little girl watched with a piece of bread in her hand and smiled. It was as if even the space itself understood that something new had been born in that little shelter. The reunion had happened, but the real world doesn't disappear just because 2 hearts choose to find each other. On the contrary, it tests, challenges, and sometimes demands that love prove its worth through struggle and courage. And Victoria Langford was ready to fight. The following week, she got out of bed before sunrise, put on a dark grey suit, and tied her hair up with precision. The image in the mirror was still that of a powerful woman, but now something inside her had changed. There was life behind her eyes, truth, and a new calm, like she finally knew where she was going. She entered the courthouse with her head held high. Benjamin was already there, surrounded by lawyers whispering instructions. He smiled when he saw her, a cold, taunting smile that said, "You don't stand a chance." But Victoria returned his look with strength. She wasn't there just as an executive. She was there as a mother, as a woman, as someone who, after many years, finally knew who she was and what she was worth. The hearing was long. Testimonies were heard. Lawyers tried to smear Jake's reputation using photos and claims that had already been disproved. But Victoria stood firm. When the judge gave her the floor, she took a deep breath and spoke with a clear, steady voice. "I was taught to build walls around my life, to hide my weaknesses, but it was a simple, honest man who showed me that what protects a child the most is genuine love. Jake didn't invade my son's life. He filled it. And if I'm here Today, it's to say that no power, no inheritance, and no influence can buy what my son found with him. A real bond. Silence, until the judge bowed his head in acknowledgement and wrote something down. A few hours later, the decision was announced. Full custody of Ethan would remain with Victoria, and all of Benjamin's attempts to use her public image against her had been officially dismissed. As she left the courtroom, she hugged Jake in the hallway, not caring who saw. The photographers waited outside, but Victoria didn't hold back. "Let's end the rumors the right way," she said, in front of everyone. The next day, during a live interview, Victoria Langford, one of the most respected women in the tech industry, said calmly, "Yes, I'm in a relationship with Jake Mitchell. He's not a millionaire. He doesn't have a title, but he has values I took a lifetime to understand." Jake, sitting beside her, held her hand firmly. The entire country heard. And for the first time, his name wasn't followed by prejudice, but by respect. Weeks later, they announced the launch of a project that had lived in both of them long before it had a name: Invisible Bridges. The foundation, headquartered in an old warehouse renovated by Jake and volunteers, offered support to single mothers, children with disabilities, and families in vulnerable situations. There were rehab rooms, workshops, libraries, and playrooms with ramps and inclusive materials. And more importantly, there was care. Victoria wore jeans and simple t-shirts when she came by. She no longer needed to hide behind an image. Jake ran the workshops with hands still marked by cement, but now with a lighter heart. One Saturday afternoon, while Ethan painted a mural with other kids, Victoria watched Jake laughing with a group of teens. She walked up slowly, and he pulled her in by the waist, with the ease of someone who knows where he belongs. "Did you know this was going to happen?" she asked, smiling. Jake looked at her gently. "No, but I hoped. Hoping is different from counting on it. Hoping is having faith." She rested her head on his shoulder, and there, surrounded by children's voices, spilled paint, and patched up hearts, the two of them knew, without needing to say it, that they were living what many spend a lifetime searching for: a real love. The Dallas evening arrived, with a sky painted in golden and lavender tones. The city, normally loud, seemed quieter in that specific part of the renewed neighborhood where the headquarters of the Invisible Bridges Foundation now stood, with colorful walls and open windows. The once abandoned building had been given new life. On the outer walls, murals painted by the children showed people holding hands, stars, access ramps, blooming trees, and wheelchair wheels turned into wings. The old had been respected, but the new overflowed with hope. There, gathered in the central courtyard, were dozens of people: families, caregivers, volunteers, neighbors. Some still bore battle scars in their eyes. Others carried renewed faith in their hearts. On a small stage made of repurposed boards, Victoria Langford adjusted the microphone. She wore dark jeans and a white linen blouse, her loose, wavy hair falling freely over her shoulders. There was no heavy makeup, no high heels. Just a whole woman, present and finally light. Jake stood beside her, arms crossed, serene expression, wearing a rolled-up shirt and the same eyes that had always looked straight into people's souls. And between them, holding both their hands, was Ethan, now 8 years old, smiling. The boy wore a blue t-shirt with the foundation's logo, printed in finger paint by the children themselves. Victoria took a few seconds in silence before speaking. She looked out at the attentive faces. Some already knew her story, others only saw her as another successful woman. But now, she wanted them all to know her truth. "For a long time I was taught to be suspicious, to build walls, to protect myself, even from what was good." She paused. Jake gently touched her shoulder with his fingertips. She went on, "I was taught to be afraid of simple people, to think love was a privilege for those who could offer stability, a name, a status. But it was a simple man with calloused hands and clear eyes who showed me what real love is. The emotional murmur of the crowd was followed by a respectful silence. She squeezed Jake's hand tighter, and he looked at her without haste, with the kind of quiet pride that doesn't need to be shown. My son didn't need more security. He needed someone who saw him, who treated him like a real boy, not a problem to be fixed. She looked at Ethan, who smiled at her like every word was a gift. Today, with this foundation, that's what we want, to see, to care, to build bridges that connect different worlds, that unite what life has separated through fear, prejudice, or indifference. Jake, always reserved, was caught off guard when Victoria turned to him in front of everyone and said, "And to you, Jake. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for staying, even when I asked you to leave." He didn't answer with words. He simply stepped forward and hugged her there in front of everyone. It was a simple gesture, but in that gesture was everything. Forgiveness, gratitude, a promise, and reunion. The audience applauded, but it wasn't the rehearsed kind of applause. It was the kind that comes from the heart and shines in the eyes of those who understood the message. At the end of the day, as colorful balloons floated into the sky and children ran across the courtyard, Victoria leaned her head on Jake's shoulder and whispered, "Sometimes the richest soul is the one that came from the ground." Jake smiled, looking at the sunset. "And sometimes it's from the ground that we learn how to fly." There was no more luxury, no more status, appearances, contracts, or spotlights. There was something rarer, purer. There was love, real, human, unbreakable. And what began as a simple gesture, half a sandwich shared on a park bench, had become the bridge that united 3 lives, and many more still to come. So, what did you think of this story? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. I'd love to know how deeply this journey touched you. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone special, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next. And before you go, I've picked out another story, even more intense and moving, that will touch your heart in an unexpected way. Watch it now.